Welcome to Fundamentals. This series has been specifically designed to equip you on your walk with Jesus. In this series, we'll dive into some of the fundamental elements of the Christian faith that we can practice in our everyday lives. Often called spiritual disciplines, they're simply ways of approaching life that help us walk out God's plan for us. Each session you'll be inspired, encouraged, and challenged to follow Jesus with your entire life. Even if you have been following Jesus for a long time, I challenge you to ask God to show you how you can become more like Him and learn something new. In this session, we are talking about the concept of Thanksgiving. So let's get started.
Our eldest daughter, Haven, just turned 3. My wife, Jandy, and I have spent the best part of the last 3 years learning what it feels like to have a little life, seemingly learning from your every move and interaction. This sense has only heightened for us with the addition of our youngest daughter, Eden. It almost feels as if every moment, every response to what's happening around us or in us, and every interaction with them and between Jandy and I is a moment of teaching or learning for both them and us. I think perhaps one of the biggest lessons I've learned so far, though, relates to our topic of conversation for today, Thanksgiving. Confession. Long before even being married, let alone having kids, I knew I wanted the kind of kids who were recognized and celebrated for their manners, their pleases and thank yous. I'm sure at some point we have all been on the receiving end of kids who either haven't been taught these basics or who have but don't action them well yet or consistently. And there is an unsanctified part of me that just doesn't respond well to those kids. I'm kidding, but this desire for our own kids meant that from as early as we could, we started to teach Haven to say please and thank you, as I know countless other parents have. During the most recent Christmas period though, we learned a lesson. To give context, we did 25 days of Thanksgiving with Haven leading right up to Christmas Day. We would start off each morning, and when I say we, I really mean my wife Jandy prepared everything, by giving Haven a box that contained a piece of scripture relating to the Christmas story, some kind of lolly, and a blank piece of paper, which was to be filled with what she was thankful for that day. We then read through that scripture with her, usually while she was chomping away on whatever lolly she had, and we would finish by asking her what she was thankful for. Now, of course, we're dealing with a toddler here. The first couple of weeks were unsurprising in terms of what she gave thanks for. Mummy, Daddy, Eden, her new little sister, Lammy, her favorite and well-loved stuffed animal, Grammy and Grandpa, her pink bike, etc. The list goes on. Something shifted though when she started to give thanks for things that she had already said. We started to ask her for something else because she had already said that thing. Now, this might just be my overly proud dad filter, but I'm convinced that I saw something click in my little girl when it comes to Thanksgiving at this point. In the following days, it was almost as if she stopped long enough to search for something to say. She started to list off the names of young adults who frequent our home, the ones who are more intentional in playing with her and caring for her. She started to list off toys that she'd played with the day before, and even experiences that she'd had in the previous days that brought her obvious joy. She was being intentional in giving thanks for things or people that went beyond her usual list. I don't know for sure, but I'd like to think that Haven developed a deeper, albeit age-appropriate understanding of Thanksgiving. In all of this, I had the realization that we had taught her the how of Thanksgiving, but we had missed walking her through the what of Thanksgiving and why we do it. I feel like the same can be said of us sometimes too. We start with and even understand the how and talk about it often, but we can become so desensitized to the what and the why that our lips are alive with words, but our hearts are numb to the deeper meaning behind them. In other words, we give thanks out of habit or ritual that isn't partnered with intent. And I'd like to think that what we witnessed in Haven over those 25 days was her developing the intent behind giving thanks. Without intent or understanding of the why, even good things can become lifeless and void of power. But here's the good news. If we can recapture the intent, habit and ritual become powerful again. So, what is Thanksgiving? Biblically speaking, Thanksgiving appears over 170 times across both the Old and New Testaments. The Old Testament alone accounts for 102 instances of its usage, with 72 of these relating directly to acknowledging what is right about God in praise and thanksgiving. The Hebrew understanding of thanksgiving was linked almost entirely to who God is, and the reasonable response to who He is was praise and thanksgiving. Of the 71 times thanksgiving appears in the New Testament, the same word is used for almost all occurrences, and it means to show oneself grateful, to be thankful, and to give thanks. This gratitude and thankfulness are both linked to and separate from the things of God. There is some active language used in this definition as well: to show, to be, to give. The New Testament understanding and usage of thanksgiving here isn't just an attitude of gratitude, it's a state of being that results in a visceral response from us. Thanksgiving then is the reasonable response of praise and gratitude to who God is and what He does. But why is it an important discipline for us in our discipleship? Out of a long list, I'd like to highlight just 2 reasons why Thanksgiving is important. The first, the Hebrew word most often used for Thanksgiving is hatorah, which actually comes from the root word yara, which means intimacy. Thanksgiving can then be seen as something that leads us to intimacy with God. To take things a step further, the Hebrew word Torah is comprised of 3 letters. The first one means truth, the second represents a doorway, and the third represents the presence of God. In other words, focusing on and giving thanks for the truth of who God is actually a doorway or an entrance point into His presence. The second, if you haven't realized by now, life can sometimes have a tendency to present difficult situations or circumstances. Interestingly, on multiple occasions, we see the biblical authors draw a connection between difficulty and thanksgiving, more specifically, thanksgiving as a response. In his letter to the Thessalonians, Paul describes thanksgiving as God's will for us, one of the few occasions where we see God's will explicitly being presented to us in Scripture. In his letter, James encourages the believers to count it, their suffering, all joy, because maturity was being developed in them. In his letter to the Romans, Paul encourages the believers to rejoice in their present suffering because it was producing perseverance, character, and hope in them. In Matthew 14, standing before a hungry crowd of arguably 20,000 or more, Jesus gave thanks for what he knew would never be enough to feed them, a mere 5 loaves and 2 fishes. With an incorrect understanding of Thanksgiving, one could be forgiven for thinking of these as callous words or even unusual responses. With a different understanding though, it becomes clear to see in the midst of difficult things, Thanksgiving actually has a role to play and presents itself as a reasonable response in light of what has been produced in us or in light of the one we are giving thanks to. In the situation of Jesus in Matthew 14, it wasn't as much about what he was giving thanks for, but who he was giving thanks to and what God was able to do. I think it's important to note that Thanksgiving doesn't ask for a spiritually inspired ignorance or denial of our circumstances, but it does recognize that there is more happening than meets the eye and takes our perspective off what is happening around us and shifts it to the one who's actually doing something in us. The journey of Thanksgiving doesn't stop here for us though. Now we've got to do it. There are 3 ways in which I think we can practice Thanksgiving coming into this year. Without trying to be too structured, over the years, I've come to break down Thanksgiving into 3 areas. Savior-based Thanksgiving, focusing on who he is. Before having kids and becoming a full-time mum, my wife Jandy would get the train to work. She wanted to use that time well, and rather than engage with the names of those on her Instagram feed, she created a list of the names of God and his attributes as presented throughout Scripture, and read through those on a daily basis. Taking that time to daily stop and engage with who God says he is in his word quickly became a habit that, while incredibly simple, was profoundly powerful in bringing her perspective back to who was with her and who she was representing in her daily going. Situation-based Thanksgiving, focusing on what he's done. As a family, we created a document about 5 years ago, which is full of prayers and processing with the Lord, called our Family Prayer Doc. At different times, both Jandy and I will contribute prayers we're praying for our family, needs we're bringing before God, and areas we feel like we need breakthrough. Years later, that document is now filled with testimony of answered prayer, met needs, and God bringing breakthrough in countless situations and circumstances. It isn't difficult to practice Thanksgiving as we sit down and see testimony after testimony of God's faithfulness to us and our family over the years. Community-based Thanksgiving, engaging where He is. I really believe that it's in the context of coming together that Thanksgiving finds a new significance. The writer of Hebrews implored the original readers, and by extension us, not to forsake gathering together, and with good reason. There is an encouragement that can only come when we gather together to give thanks for both who God is and what He's done. Often this looks like corporate worship, singing our thanksgiving to God about who He is. Whether it's online or in person, coming together in corporate worship and participating in the community of God still needs to be a priority for those that follow Him. I really do believe that as we give thanks for who God is, for what He's done, and continue to do that, gathering together in community, we'll find ourselves growing in intimacy with Him and see things like maturity, perseverance, character, and hope growing in us. Let's recommit to the discipline of Thanksgiving together.
Do you ever find yourself giving thanks out of habit but not really stopping to think about the how or the why? As we learn in this session, the Bible reminds us that thanksgiving is our reasonable response to who God is and what He does. It should be only natural that when we remind ourselves of just how incredible He is, we couldn't help but give Him thanks. Thanksgiving builds intimacy when we focus on and give thanks for the truth of who God is, and ultimately creates a doorway into His presence. And when life gets tough, as it often does, giving thanks in those circumstances doesn't diminish them, but rather helps us to step back and put our trust in the one who sees all things, not just what we're facing right now. Does life feel tough right now? If you're in the midst of difficult circumstances, why not take some time to remind yourself of who God is? He's promised to never leave or forsake us, and we know that He can work through all things. Start by giving God thanks for who He is and ask Him to show you what you can be thankful for in this season. Being thankful is a wonderful habit to have, but it's even better when it's out of the overflow of our love for God. If you want a deeper relationship with God, start by giving thanks for all He's done.